it's my very great pleasure to introduce Rosamond Mahony. She's as you all know, I'm sure she needs no introduction, but she's the younger daughter of Richard Adams. She was born in London and grew up there in Islington, witnessing the birth of the book being told as a story on journeys in the car with her father and sister. Currently a director of Watership Down Enterprises, Rose is committed to the legacy of this children's classic for current and future generations of readers and fans. She lives in Farnham in London, where she enjoys walking, gardening, reading, and cooking at home in the country. As I said before, this is like, I'm slightly starstruck, as you can see. But please join me in welcoming Rosamond Mahony.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Is that all right at the back? Yes, good. Right. Well, we're going right back to brass tacks. We're going right back to the beginning. We're going to forget all about the film for now. We're going to talk about what actually happened right back in 1966, when my father wrote Watership Down over the years 1966 to 67, when he was 46 years old. It was, as I think most people now know, the result of telling his two daughters, then aged 6 and 8, myself and my sister Juliet, a story to while away a long car journey. We lived in a very ordinary house in Islington in North London, and not, as is often erroneously thought, in the country. Every year in the summer, my father would take us girls to Stratford-upon-Avon to see a Shakespeare play at the RSC. Fast bowling, you might think, for two little girls, but that was typical of Daddy. He believed that children were capable of much more than was often asked of them, and he hated what he called talking down to children. He would read the chosen play, As You Like It, The Merchant of Venice, or Midsummer Night's Dream, or whatever it was, out loud in manageable sized chunks at bedtime, while we listened and learned to play. Then we would go and see it. Not always at Stratford, it might be the Old Vic or the National Theatre. And he did the same for us with opera, and we loved it. The highlight of the year was the annual trip to Glasgow, for usually a Mozart opera. But I digress. We told my father that we thought his story about rabbits, one of whom has second sight, was so good he ought to write it down. It was only one of many stories that he told us over the years. And he hesitated for a while, but finally agreed. Of course, the finished story we read today is very different and more detailed than the one he told us all those years ago. Also, there were things that were left out from the original story. Every night after he had come home from work, had his supper and read to us girls, my father would go to the study and sit down for another night's writing. Sometimes he would write until 1 o'clock in the morning and would go to bed, get up and go back in the morning to his job at the Ministry of Housing and Local Government in Whitehall, attired in his city suit and bowler hat with rolled umbrella. He was something of a showman. He did this night after night until the book was finished, and he was a very focused and hard-working individual. So, let us leave Watership Down for now, lying in a drawer, and move on to my father. What sort of a man was he? Well, he was very intelligent and had an almost photographic memory. He could quote enormous amounts of poetry by heart and knew Shakespeare inside out. He had so many interests, it was a job to keep up with him. Birds and birdsong, chess, opera, and music in general. He had an enormous library of books, some of which he had had since childhood, and he thought a great deal of Jane Austen and said that he believed that Emma was possibly the finest novel ever written. Daddy was extremely fond of the Lake District. He knew it very well indeed, and my parents went to Seathwaite for their honeymoon in 1949. He spent many happy hours walking the fells, Scarfell, Crinkle Crags, and Walner Scar, accompanied by his trusty copies of Wainwright. His book, The Plague Dogs, is set there, and many of the characters in the book were real people that he knew. He was very keen on English folk song and knew a lot about Cecil Sharp and his history. He often visited Cecil Sharp House in Hampstead, and he particularly loved madrigals. He was, of course, passionate about the country, nowadays known as the countryside, a term which he absolutely hated, and always researched the subjects for his books carefully, talking to knowledgeable people and doing a lot of background reading. Ronald Blockley, who we were discussing earlier, and wrote The Private Life of the Rabbit, actually became a lifelong friend. Daddy also built up a fine wine collection when finances allowed and enjoyed a pint in the local and a game of cribbage or backgammon. He was a fine bridge player and taught us girls many card games. He was also an excellent fly fisherman and liked nothing more than a day on the Test in Hampshire, a river he had known since childhood. Having said all this, he had something of a short temper and never suffered fools gladly. He also loved to be the centre of attention, which he was during the latter part of his life. He could be a hard taskmaster for children, but also an extremely involved and loving parent. So, what of Watership Down? Well, it was submitted no fewer than 5 times to all the major publishing houses, including Faber and Methuen. And quite hilariously, we now have a file of letters explaining why Watership Down is actually no good and will never be published. The reasons include, number 1, it is far too long. Number 2, adults wouldn't want to read about bunny rabbits and children would find it too difficult. Number 3, the rabbit language is too confusing. Number 4, the Ella Ferrara stories are a distraction from the main book. Number 5, talking animals are old hat. Number 6, the chapter headings are far too difficult and just plain confusing. And funnily enough, these are now exactly the reasons people write and tell us that they love the book. So how wrong can you be? Anyway, early in 1972, my father spotted in the Times Literary Supplement that a tiny publisher called Rex Collings had just published an edition of Wood Magic by Richard Jefferies. And he thought that someone who had published that might possibly like Watership Down. So he packed it up and sent it off. Amazingly enough, Rex Collings, the man, rang my father and asked him out to lunch. And at that lunch, he told my father that he liked the book and would like to publish it. And as my father afterwards said, I immediately couldn't eat a thing. I think it would be an understatement to say that he was elated. In November 1972, Watership Down was published in a tiny print run of, I believe, 10,000 copies. It immediately began to garner extraordinary press attention. People began to search for it, and Rex Collings had a job to keep up with demand. In 1973, the lovely Kay Webb of Puffin Books read it and decided that it must be published in paperback, which it duly was. From then on, it never looked back, ultimately crossing the Atlantic and proving a runaway success. It won the Carnegie Medal for Children's Literature, and my father was presented in 1975 with The Golden Rabbit by Penguin Books to mark 1 million copies being sold. And here it is. Oh. You can come up and have a look at it later if you like. Of course, all of this changed our lives forever. My father gave up his job in the civil service and began the life of a world-famous author, or WFA, as we like to jokingly. A lot of this life was on the road, particularly in America, where it seemed they just couldn't get enough of him. But that didn't mean that he gave up writing, not a bit of it. He always said that his next book, Shardik, was the finest book he ever wrote, and thought that it was better than Watership Down. He subsequently wrote many other novels, Plague Dogs, Traveller, A Girl in a Swing, Daniel, but none of them had the enormous appeal of Watership Down. So, what can we take away from the story of Watership Down? Well, I think in my father's case, it was about believing in yourself and what you have done and never giving up. My father was offered the option by one publishing house of cutting out the Ella Ferrara stories, cutting the book down to 150 pages and removing the Lapine language, and then they would publish it. And he said, no, the book stands as it is, and he wouldn't do it. And why such huge appeal? I think a really good fantasy takes us away from the everyday and immerses us into a world that is far removed from our own. In this case, oddly enough, one of rabbits. Some people have said that the book is too violent for children. I do not agree, and my sister and I were adamant that none of the main characters should die, as it would be too sad. There is certainly danger and fear and darkness, but what is a fantasy without these things? It has very little excitement, and this is a theme as old as time. So where did my father get his imagination from? I think he was a very sensitive little boy and had the huge advantage of a great education. He also had many experiences during the war and gleaned a lot of his ideas from that. And if anyone wants to know more about his early life, I can thoroughly recommend his autobiography, which is here, The Day Gone By, which is a wonderful book and one which gives a much more detailed picture of his life than I can here. And I hold this book very dear to my heart. I know Daddy would have been delighted to think that Watership Down was being celebrated in such a way by this wonderful conference after 50 years. Sadly, he is not with us anymore, but the family are very proud of his accomplishments. And that family now runs to 6 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. I must finish by saying thank you to all the speakers here today and those tomorrow, who sadly I shall not be seeing. And we are so thrilled that Watership Down still offers its enduring appeal and wisdom. And in the theme of all the best writing, such as Shakespeare, it makes you laugh and it makes you cry and everything in between. And I hope it will continue to do so for many years to come.
That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you ever so much. I think, Marika, I'm going to take it down again now so that we can
Just,
sit together.
you can just, yeah.
Oh, there we go. I can sit with you now and take the questions. I've got hundreds of questions to ask, but I probably shouldn't take advantage of my chair's prerogative and open to the floor first. Yes, Andy.
Yes, thanks to meet you. Wow, it is amazing to meet you. And I just have to say, I had the incredible pleasure to work at Glasgow for 11 years as director of development. So I know what it's like.
How lovely it is then.
Exactly. My interest, and I'm giving a paper tomorrow on it, is on the Lupine language. I study invented languages. And do you have any memories or recollections of your father talking about the actual invention of the Lupine language and how he went about doing it and what his inspirations might have been for it?
Well, I think the Lupine language was not originally included in the story as it was told on the way to Stratford, and indeed later on the way to school when we finished the story. I think he made it up in his mind. I think it also has more than a passing reference to Arabic, but fundamentally it is constructed in such a way that particular words mean particular things. For instance, El Ahrar is the prince with 1,000 enemies. El Ahrar, many, Ra, king, Elil, enemies. And a lot of the words are constructed in that kind of way. He always said he wanted to make it a sort of wuffy, fluffy language that rabbits might be able to pronounce. And I think that's probably the derivation of the language.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. Further questions? Yes.
Thank you. That was so interesting. I am particularly interested in the classical references in Watership Down and also the classical quotations that we often find in Watership Down. I chose the college that I studied at because it was where your father studied, and I think I studied classics in English because of this book, pretty much. I was wondering if you could talk at all about just his classical experience. He's obviously an incredibly well-read person, and that was very clear to tell just from reading the book. But yeah, anything to do with Latin and Greek, I suppose.
Well, my father studied Latin and Greek to what we would now call GCSE, no higher than that.
Oh, wow.
But of course, everybody in those days at public schools was forced to do that. So he had a basic knowledge of Greek, but really no more than that. He had read, I think, almost all the Greek plays in translation. And he was also extremely fond of, I don't know if anybody here knows, at Bradfield School, they have a Greek theatre, which is known as Greeka, where they perform every 3 years a play in Greek. And he was always passionate about that and the sound of Greek as it is spoken, although he wasn't classically a Greek scholar. But he now has a granddaughter who is a Greek scholar, and I know had he still been here with us, he would have been incredibly proud. And I think that he had a great love of Greek, even though he wasn't a Greek scholar.
It's fascinating how the education system has changed so much in that time. I always assumed he had gone way far past GCSE or this, but yeah, that's fascinating to know. Okay, yes.
Right, I was wondering because obviously your dad wrote Watership Down kind of later in life, and he has this in common with one of my favorite authors, which is William Golding. And as someone who doesn't feel like they've done a lot with their life and is 33 at this point, I kind of use them as reference points of like, you know, there's time, there's plenty of time. It doesn't matter when you do it, it matters that you do it. But I just wondered if he kind of always had the desire to write or to do something other than what he was doing, or if it was a case of, oh, this is like a good idea, and I am, you know, I've accumulated all this life experience, all these things I can quote, all these things I can put into it, because I kind of see it ultimately as like he couldn't have written Watership Down earlier. It was you and your sister as a catalyst, and then all these things he picked up throughout his life, which then went into it. It would have been a completely different book if he happened to have the idea at like 20. Sorry, I rambled a lot there.
It's a good question though. So was it always
that's a very interesting question. No, he was always a writer. He was writing poetry when he was at school. He always enjoyed making up stories. He was a bit of a magpie. He picked up experiences. I'm sure most writers do this. They take bits and pieces of experience from their life and sort of make them into a homogeneous mass for a story. If you do chance to read his book, The Day Gone By, you'll see a lot about where he picked things up from and how he wove them into experiences, poetry, writing, storytelling. And so I would say no, he wrote Watership Down. It was something I think that was inside him waiting to happen. And I think it had been a long time coming. And yes, as he always said, if I had realised I could write so well, I would have done it a lot sooner.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah.
You've touched on it here and there. If you could maybe expand on what you see as the main differences between that original oral version and the thing that was actually published.
Well, one thing you have to remember is that I was 6 years old, and that is a very, very long time ago. Obviously, the story that you tell in the car to entertain two little girls of 6 and 8 is going to be pretty different from something that comes out which is about as thick as that. And of course, you know, the descriptive passages and that kind of thing were not in the original story. I don't remember much else, but I do remember us both being absolutely adamant that nobody was to die, because that was not going to be a fun book for children. And this is why I find it faintly amusing that people always home in on the fact that Watership Down is so violent. Actually, it's not. Nobody dies. Bad things happen, but then bad things do happen in exciting stories. You know, they wouldn't be exciting if things didn't go wrong sometimes. And I think that makes it more exciting. The story certainly had excitement, but it was almost certainly not very like what we see today as the actual book. So from my memory, that's all I can tell you.
That's fascinating. Of course, in the film, somebody does die, the token female that escapes
Yes,
from
yes.
Hamilton Warren,
Yes.
and then they don't know what to do with her, so they kill her.
That's right, and that's one of the reasons that I'm not altogether keen on films, because they do change things, and not always can the estate do anything about that. And you know, you're left saying, well, okay,
It's a separate thing.
it's a separate thing. Yeah.
Sure. Further questions? Yes.
Yeah, fascinating to get that insight. As a musician, an independent musician myself, what's involved in the estate looking after the copyright of the father as a publisher, as an author?
As an author, well, at the moment, we hold copyright. I don't know exactly when it goes out of copyright, but it's still quite a long way away. We hold copyrights all over the world for different translations into different languages. And we have recently won back the film rights from Martin Rosen, which you may have read about in the newspaper. There's quite a protracted court case about that. And the estate were absolutely delighted because things had perhaps not gone exactly as they should have done, which is a shame. I think my father would have been very upset had he still been here to see it, but he wasn't, so that was maybe a good thing. But no, basically, we hold the copyrights.
Okay, I think I'm going to take my chance now for 1 second, and I'll go. I was just fascinated by your mention of Cecil Sharp and folklore and folk music. And I was actually, one of our common friends between John Ratcliffe, who spoke earlier, Andy, and Douglas Anderson in the States, we managed to find a copy of the library of Richard Adams, which was auctioned a few years ago, I think 2014.
When my father died, yes.
That's it.
Right.
And I was fascinated by the amount of books on folklore and fairy tales, as well as the classics. So I just wanted to know how much of that library, I mean, that's a very specific question, but how much of the library was there in his formative years, and how much was sort of collecting really nice pieces after?
That's a very good question. A lot of the books that he had for a very long time, right up from childhood. So he had a beautiful set. We've still got it of Beatrix Potter on a little original wooden bookshelf. Lots of other books too, lots of Kipling, books from childhood, but he collected books all through his life. One of the things that was a great joy to him when he actually made a bit of money was to be able to buy books that he really, really wanted and valued and loved. And when he died, we had great difficulty deciding what was to go and what was to stay, because some had tremendous sentimental value, others had more financial value. It was a really, really difficult job. But no, he loved books all through his life, and it was a great joy to him to be able to buy books that he really, really loved.
Okay, who was it?
It's me. As a little girl being told stories, did you ask your dad to tell you stories about girl rabbits? Because I just remember when we told stories in our family, I was never interested in the boys and always wanted the girls to have a bigger part in it.
Well, do you know, it's a funny thing, but I remember the stories that he told us. The stories were very much sort of ambidextrous, if you like. You know, it was a story about a mole or a rabbit or a robin or a mouse. It wasn't stated what the sex of the said creature was. And as children, you don't really think to ask.
Because it wasn't people, because it wasn't children, it was animals.
It was always animals.
Yeah.
He never told us stories about children. It was always animals. So it was never really stated, I suppose. Could have been either.
Yeah.
Could have been either.
No, thank you.
It never really came into it.
Thank you. There and then.
So on behalf of my partner, can't be today, Becky. She'd like to know whether you had a dog as a kid and a cat, and whether the scene with the cat was actually something that happened or that your dad made up entirely.
I was expecting somebody was going to ask that.
I'm assuming you mean the cat at Nuthanger Farm.
Yes.
But the answer to your question is yes, we did have a dog, and yes, we did have a cat. Neither of them feature in Watership Down. The cat at Nuthanger Farm was just the farm cat in general. Our dog was an absolute nightmare. His name was Will, and he regularly bit children because he hated them. He used to have to be persuaded to sit for photo shoots when photographers came. We used to have to feed him bits of things to make him sit down and behave. We loved him passionately, even though he was such a nightmare. He died at the age of about 13, shortly after we moved to the Isle of Man. My mother was heartbroken, even though he bit her. I can't tell you how many times. It was a funny world in those days. You didn't think about having animals put down. You just sort of got on with it, you know. But, and the cat, I remember, we had him for years. His name was Jan. Was found dead as stiff as a poker in the dog's basket one weekend when we came back from the country. He was absolutely like a board, poor chap. I was scared of him. But yes, the answer to your question is yes, we did.
Okay. I think
Sorry, my second question, but I'd be just interested in knowing, so there was another author who started writing a very famous book by telling his children stories, and of course that was J.R.R. Tolkien with The Hobbit. I'm just wondering, did your father ever talk about Tolkien, or had he read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and did he ever mention Tolkien?
Yes, he was a big Tolkien fan. He certainly read all of the books. I don't think he ever read them to us. He read us an awful lot of things at bedtime. He read us Dickens, he read us Moonfleet, he read us all sorts of things. Kipling, lots of different things. But I don't think he ever read us Tolkien. But no, he was a big fan, and he featured heavily in our childhood. So yes.
excellent. Yeah, that's interesting, especially in relation to invented languages as well.
Yes, yeah.
Great. Yes.
Again. I grew up in Bristol, and I remember seeing a show at the Bristol Vic, which was done actually by Filton College students, but I can't find any record of it, where they did a musical version of Watership Down. And the only thing I remember from it was at one point Holly sings a song, and I remember how the line "It comes from men" goes, which was a refrain in that song. I also found a record of a theatrical production of Watership Down in 2016 at the Theatre on the Mill. I was just wondering, you talked about your dad's interest in theatre. I wonder if you ever saw any theatrical adaptations of Watership Down, or ever was interested in that, I suppose.
Yes, there have been several adaptations of Watership Down musically over the years. I remember one particularly at Hammersmith. What's the name of the theatre at Hammersmith? The Lyric, that's right. There was a very good one there, which he was persuaded to go to. He was getting very elderly by this time, and it was very difficult for him to get out. He needed a wheelchair, and it was hard work for him. But we persuaded him to go, and he was absolutely delighted with it, and met the cast. And the cast were absolutely lovely to him and made him feel so happy. It was such a great day out. There was another one at the Watermill in Newbury, which he also attended, and that was very good as well. And there are a couple of things in the pipeline which I'm not really at liberty to talk about at the moment, but let's say there's some interest.
Thank you. Right. Exciting things. Okay. Further questions? Yes.
This is not a question, but just on the subject of musical adaptations, there was an American children's theatre group from New York, I think, who a couple of years ago did a musical crossover between Watership Down and Les Mis, and it's excellent. And if I can find the link, I can share it out on Twitter. It was completely wonderful. I think they did it during the pandemic remotely. It was all over Zoom, and it was just really lovely. I'm sure if he was a fan of Les Mis, maybe he would have really liked it. Thank you.
Yes, on the whole, he was a fan of musical theatre, but opera was really his big love. I would say, I don't think he ever saw Liz. He did see cats, and I think he quite liked that. But that was probably because it was about cats. And he wasn't very keen on people. But yes, there have been several adaptations, and I think it's nice that it still inspires people today, which is great. Really fantastic.
Right, Marita. Yes, of course you have a question.
I don't actually. I'm just.
Oh, it's a question from our online attendees. Thank you.
John Radcliffe asks, are there any unpublished works by your father that might someday see the light of day?
That was John who gave the paper.
Well, now that is a very interesting question, because I have 4 large boxes at home of possible books that could be published. Not all of them are complete, because my father worked over and over and over his manuscripts. They're so written and overwritten and overwritten and you know, extra bits added on all over the place. Some of them are not as polished as they might be, but the answer to that question is yes, there are at least 2 books which have not been published and could possibly be one day.
Very good question from them. Yeah.
At the end of the book, Hazel is taken away by a unnamed rabbit, and in the film, it is the Black Rabbit inlay. But I've seen, like, in the illustrated version, it's actually Ella Ra who takes him away. And so I was wondering if there's, like, if you know who actually took him away, if it's Black Rabbit or Ella Ra.
You know, I'm very, very glad you asked this question, because it's something that has really bothered me about the second version of Watership Down, the animated one. In the book, the rabbit who comes to take Hazel away is obviously Ella Ra, because he has the starlight ears. And Hazel recognises him and knows who it is who's come for him. If it had been a Black Rabbit of inlay, that would have been tantamount to the devil coming to get you. And I don't think that would have been a very good idea. So I can tell you unequivocally, the answer to your question is it was Ella Ra who came to take him.
Excellent. Yeah, I was quite upset with that scene as well, for the same reasons. Yes.
I just had a quick follow-up to your previous tease about 2 unpublished books. Are they animal characters?
I don't know how much I'm at liberty to disclose. One of them is, and one of them is not.
Okay.
One of them is my personal favourite.
Wow.
And one of them I haven't read in its entirety, so I don't really know. And that one is about people. I haven't read that. I mean, you have to understand that when my father died, he left an enormous amount of what we now call the archive. Huge amounts of paper, huge amounts of manuscripts, huge amounts of typescripts. Everything had to be gone through and boxed and labelled and shipped off. The boxes that I've got are the ones that we have of the books that we know that are still unpublished, and indeed poetry. So that is what I can tell you.
Amazing. Rob.
Thank you. It's been absolutely amazing hearing your revelations about your father. I had one which was, he was obviously very committed and passionate about his opposition to slavery and enslavement. I wondered if that was something that he spoke about. You think about Shardik and his use of it.
Yes, I think you have to remember that Daniel, which is his last published book, was written when he was really pretty old. It's not nearly as long, and it's perhaps not as three-dimensional as his other books. I think slavery was something which he always thought deeply about and felt very passionately about, and that is why he wrote Daniel, the book. But the thing about Daddy was he was always coming up with new ideas of books that he was going to write. I mean, even when he was, well, in the last 6 weeks of his life, when he was virtually dying, he still had an idea of a book that he was going to write. It was a jolly good idea too, actually. I thought it would be a winner, but unfortunately, he ran out of time. And yes, slavery was something that was always something he thought very deeply about. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, I feel like this was like quite a trivial question after that. Yeah, much more profound question about Amazon. But this is where you talk about music and the interest in music. And I just wondered about your father's thoughts or your thoughts or feelings about Art Garfunkel's song. What are those, the visceral reactions to that song? So many people have conversations about it.
Well, what do I think about it? Obviously, it's an incredibly well-known song. It's incredibly popular. It's very catchy. It sums up a certain time in my life. I mean, you have to remember I was 18 when the film came out. I wasn't particularly keen to be cast as a little Twinkie Winkie holding a cuddly bunny at that age. I think we were all really rather chuffed that it went to #1 for such a long time. I mean, it was there for about 8 weeks, I think. And if it brought so much happiness to so many people, then that's absolutely fine by me. You still hear it played occasionally, and I think, oh, there it is, which is nice. So yeah, well, fair play. It was a good song, and it made a lot of people happy. So very good.
Okay. Well, we did it again. Come on, that's your last chance, people, because we're not getting very close to the time now.
So there are many adaptations in terms of film. I know you've talked about the 1978 movie, but there's also like a miniseries, Netflix miniseries, as well as a TV show. I was just wondering what's your opinion on those as well, because they changed the plot dramatically as well.
The Netflix was the one with BBC, right?
Yes. You're obviously a lady with your finger on the pulse if you know about the mini-series. That, I believe, only came out in America. And that was another thing which was not really much to do with the estate. So perhaps I better not say too much. The second adaptation, the most recent one that just came out, we collaborated on that, and we worked very hard with the guys who were doing it to bring it to as realistic an interpretation as we could, not only in terms of the story, but in terms of the background of the flowers and the plants. Because I think one of the most important things about Watership Down is the natural world that it conjures up in people's minds. And if you're watching a film, you're relying on the film to show you what the author is trying to say. And they worked very, very hard on that. And I think they did a fantastic job. So yeah, pretty good.
There we go. I think that's probably a good point. Unless somebody's dying for a question and I sort of miss, I hope I didn't miss anyone.
Here.
From this, there's somebody from the online. Last one now.
So Michael,
yeah, who's got one of the recorded papers, yeah.
In the telling before the writing of Watership Down, do you recall much tension between Bigwig and Hazel? Did that change in the novel?
Well, as I say, I was 6 years old, so to be perfectly honest with you, no, I don't recall that at all. But in the novel, no, I don't think there is. The thing about Bigwig is he's very well-meaning, but he's a hothead. And he needs Hazel to be that calming influence to calm him down. The bit where he gets into the snare at Cowslip's Warren, just before that, he said, to hell with you, Fiver, I'm not listening to what you're saying anymore, you're talking rubbish. I've trusted you this far, but now you've really lost the plot. And then he goes storming off and finishes up in the snare. That's typical of Bigwig, because he is a bruiser. He acts first and thinks second. Whereas Hazel is the complete opposite of that. Hazel is a thinker. He thinks things through first. And that's what makes him a great leader.
Right. Well, this is the point where I think we can't keep Rosamond anymore, but I thank you all for your questions, and please join me in thanking once more Rosamond for sharing all of those amazing memories and views and ideas about her father's work. It's been an absolute privilege to have you here with us. Thank you very much.